Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we delve into a very uh, imaginative exercise of seeking to discern the future. It's something that we humans would love to be able to do more capably than we can. Throughout history, those who have sought to predict history in the future have almost all ended up being wrong one way or another, but we continue to do it. It's a perennial occupation and fascination of we humans about how to second guess unfolding events. But before we dive into that very interesting domain, we're going to continue our commentary as we bear witness to the genocide that's taking place against the Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank, particularly in Gaza, which has unfolded over the last nearly 5 months in the aftermath of the attack by Hamas on October 7th. We've been recounting the history of the Middle East, the history of the last 100 years. We've been telling the story of the rise of Hamas. We culminated yesterday in the events leading up to Hamas attacking on the 7th of October. And today I want to offer some historical comparisons to that event. One of the things that we are discerning about the actual attack on October 7th is that it's still mired in misinformation and essential mystery. There's not any clarity either from the Israelis or from Hamas or from the United States as to what exactly happened. What we do know is that several hundred Palestinians, mostly teenagers and in their 20s, broke out of the barricades where the Palestinians have been kept essentially in a concentration camp since 2007, which has been sealed off without the right of the Palestinians to go in and out except with strictures and work permits. Israelis are not allowed into the Gaza Strip. So the situation was that most of the people, probably all the young men who participated in the Hamas attack, had never been out of their concentration camp. This was the first time that they had left. And when they did, they overwhelmed the outpost there at the gate. They spilled into some neighboring towns. They killed upwards of 500-600 people. Another 400 or 500 were killed actually by the Israelis as they counterattacked. There was an attack on a rock festival in the Negev, and that was seen on television. So we had, in the end, nearly 1,100 people that were killed, not only Israelis, but people of different nationalities, and about 250, or actually it were counted to 247 hostages that the young men took back into Gaza and hid away deep in the tunnels. This has been called a major act of terrorism. Hamas has been identified as a terrorist organization, and because of the outrage of the Israelis against this terrorism and this barbarism, we have had the last 5 months of killing or wounding well over 100,000 people, depriving them of food and water to such an extent that Palestinians, mostly children, have been starving to death, and people randomly shot. Another 35, if my count was correct, were killed in the last 24 hours. How do we think about this? How do we evaluate when an oppressed group takes dramatic action and kills a bunch of the oppressors, both military and civilian, often in brutal ways? There are two historical antecedents that I would like to draw to our collective attention. One from Germany in the 1930s and 40s that gave rise to the Warsaw Ghetto, and the other, the slave revolt of Nat Turner in August of 1831 in the United States. The parallels between what the Germans did to the Jews in Germany and Europe and what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians has been noted by scores of commentators around the world. It's been one of those extraordinary moments where those that were most acutely oppressed have become the oppressors. And that is something that is very common in history. It is certainly not unique to the Israelis. And we find an extraordinary parallel to what Hamas did on October 7th with the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in early 1943. The Germans, like the Israelis, had rounded up the Jews in Poland and put them in a concentration camp, put them in a ghetto, as it was called, beginning in 1939. And over 400,000 people were crammed in an area about 2.2 by 2.2 miles. It was so crowded that many of them didn't have any place to stay. Like what the Israelis have done to the Palestinians in Gaza, the Germans cut off food, cut off water to minimal existence, and people started to starve. Infectious diseases, like is happening in Gaza, began to spread. In that case, it was typhus, and thousands of people died. Then in late 1942, they began the mass deportations of several 100,000 of the ghetto dwellers to the concentration camps, largely Treblinka, which was one of the work and death camps, leaving a smaller number that thought at that time that maybe that was all that was going to happen. And then Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, came in January of 1943 and ordered the evacuation of another 9,000 Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto. And despair began to become prevalent. And that is when a group of young men and women in their early 20s said, enough is enough, we're going to fight back. And they began to fight back. And to their surprise, the Germans retreated. And they thought maybe they were able to win the day. But that was not to be. And on April 19th, right in advance of Hitler's birthday, on the 20th of April, Heinrich Himmler ordered the complete destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto. and Malik Edelman and a number of the young men who'd been living in the sewers. There weren't tunnels, there were just sewers with raw sewage, old sewers, began to fight back and pop up out of the sewer holes, that you see in the streets and shoot some Germans and go back down in it. And the Germans, tried to smoke them out and use various means to eliminate them. And the Jews held out between the 19th of April and about the 20th of May when they were killed to the last man and woman, although some of them took their own life. And that event galvanized world Jewry, and those terrorists, as they were called by the Germans, were heralded as great heroes of the Jewish people. Although very interestingly, their leader, Malik Edelman, refused to go to Israel after the war when he saw what the Israelis were doing to the Palestinians. He said, it's the same as what the Germans did to us. And he was always, to his dying day, militantly opposed to the Zionist agenda in Israel and supported with alacrity the Palestinian cause, saying that having endured what he endured, he would never participate in inflicting this on another people. In the United States in 1830, a young Black man was born into slavery in Virginia, and his name was Nat. And that's all they named them in those days. They had no last names. They were just named by their first names because they were property. And while he was a child, he was sold 4 times to new slave owners, till finally he was sold to a man named Turner. And that's how Nat Turner got his name. They just gave the name of the last slave owner. Turned out that Nat was prodigiously intelligent, which was remarked by both the Black people who knew him and the white people who knew him, that he was a man of extraordinary insight and with a power of oratory such that he became a preacher and regaled the Black people every Sunday with stories from the book of Exodus and the Bible, where the people, the oppressed people, overthrew their oppressors. And then in 1831, with a handful of other slaves, he broke out of the plantation. He killed Turner and his entire family and proceeded to kill about 65 white people, men, women, and children, including beheading them until the revolt was broken by local militia and soldiers. Nat Turner escaped. Then he was caught, basically starving to death in the forest of near where he had escaped, living in a hole underneath a tree that had fallen over, and but had no food and was just slowly dying of starvation. He was found. He was taken in. He was hung, and then his body was drawn and quartered. Desecrated. But very interestingly, while he was waiting to be hung, one of the attorneys got him to tell his story And you can still read to the present day the Confessions of Nat Turner. It's an extraordinary work, one of the most moving books I've ever read. The Confessions of Nat Turner. So here was a man who had killed men, women, and children, including beheading them, in this outrage over what he was subjected to, as he was denied a normal life simply because of the color of his skin. And yet today, he is heralded as one of the great figures in American history, certainly in African-American history, as a man who stood up and organized the kind of rebellion. It was the largest slave revolt in the history of the United States, Nat Turner's revolt in August of 1831. I raise these because it opens up the question of Hamas. Were these young men terrorists? Or was this a slave revolt? Was this a ghetto uprising? Were these freedom fighters who will go down in history as a small group of young men who, right at the point when they were being wiped out, took dramatic action that possibly saved their people from extinction? It's very important when we listen to world events and we're told unceasingly 24/7 that this group are terrorists and the other group are freedom fighters, or this person is the enemy and this person is the friend, to really consider deeply whether that is in fact true, and whether or not, as we saw from the history of Hamas, which use both violence and nonviolence as a method of resistance, and October 7th return to the exercise of violence. Let us think of Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress and Desmond Tutu, heroes of our time now, but at the time of apartheid were imprisoned, considered terrorists and communists, and a threat to the divinely ordained order of apartheid in South Africa. History has a very subtle way of bringing the truth to light. And as William Lloyd Garrison, the great abolitionist, said of Nat Turner in the aftermath of that revolt, knowing 65 white people had been killed in a brutal way, he said, in the end, I do not condone, but neither do I condemn what Nat Turner did. And I think that observation by William Lloyd Garrison on Nat Turner is a word of wisdom as we contemplate what Hamas did in their resistance against the Israelis, and how that resistance has now ignited the conscience of the world, which is now inflamed in solidarity and support for the Palestinian people and for Hamas. And it is only the United States and Israel that are holding out against a ceasefire, and a few other countries in the G7. But even Great Britain and France abstained in the last vote on whether there should be a ceasefire. So the growing moral sensitivity to what's taking place in Gaza is compelling humanity to look genocide right in the eye without flinching, as we've been doing every day on Humanity Rising. So that in some mysterious way that we cannot even understand, our souls will be quickened and animated. And finally, at long last, having repented of slavery after the carnage of the Civil War and multiple slave rebellions, from Nat Turner's to those in Haiti and around the world repented of slavery. And now I think the actions of Hamas and the resistance of the Palestinian people to genocide might be the occasions, if we would only seize it, for the world to repent of genocide. So thank you, everyone, for joining Humanity Rising today. It's always so deeply important for us to consider, in a scope of both discernment and compassion, unfolding world events as they press upon us day by day. I'd like to now turn to the issue of discerning the future with a gentleman that I've recently come to know, Benjamin Butler, who was an investor, worked on Wall Street, consulted with major corporations and investment banks on how to invest, was very interested in philosophy and spirituality, went to Japan, learned Japanese, has done a lot of Zen meditation, and has contemplated, how do we look at the future for many, many years as a consultant and as a practitioner. So Benjamin Butler, I'd like to invite you to join the program.
Hi, Jim. Thank you for
Benjamin's coming in from Wales, the beautiful country of Wales today. So Benjamin, thank you so much for joining us. And why don't we start by just telling us of your background. Tell us your story and how you got into everything from Zen in Japan to contemplation of the philosophical implications of future studies.
Yeah, well, thank you for the introduction, and thanks for your courageous words on a really important global topic, which perhaps we might want to circle back on. Well, I was brought up, I do have some Welsh blood, I have a lot of Celtic blood. So on the, people talk about the north-south divide in the UK, but actually historically there's an east-west divide. So the Celtic areas, the strongholds that weren't marauded by the invaders as much as the east, were of course Wales, Scotland, and Cornwall, and Devon. And these areas still have sort of quite a lot of pride in themselves. Wales is interesting because it's the first nation on the planet to introduce a Future Generations Commissioner. So they actually have a futurist who's meant to represent those future generations and has a little bit of power. Yeah, I was born and bred in the UK, probably read too much fantasy novels and science fiction. And so after doing some law studies, I decided I wanted to travel the world and go to Japan. And so I studied Japanese and economics, went to Wall Street, was my first job. And because I spoke Japanese, I was then seconded to Tokyo. And so I had this interest in the life of being in international finance. It was sort of a double life. I would travel between New York and Tokyo, be talking to global investors. Became an investor myself eventually. But then in my spare time, I really immersed myself in Japanese culture and Zen philosophy. Yeah, worked out of many of the financial capitals of the world, and then got into, I guess I had one of those moments of life where I sort of questioned everything. And I used to joke I had the German car, the Swiss bank account, the beautiful Korean wife, and Italian clothes, and all the rest of it. But my job was really intellectually fascinating because everything was relevant. A lot of my job was macro related, so I was looking at joining the dots between all these different trends. So intellectually, it was fascinating, but my soul was yearning for something deeper. I knew I was here for something more than helping other people make money. And so rather abruptly, I quit the industry. And then I got into venture. So I started to use my sort of spiritual approach in the finance world, and got into venture investment on the west coast of California. Yeah, mainly California. We were early investors in like Silicon Beach, LA, those kind of places, and then ended up actually as an investor in TikTok. That's a long story, and then I transitioned again. So the third transition was sort of, I described the first part of my career as trying to always forecast the future, looking at these big trends, and then either invest in deploying capital myself or helping like chief investment officers look at asset allocation, etc. So that was forecasting the future. The second part was making the future, which is what entrepreneurs do, and that was utterly fascinating. And then the third part was I sort of, now I'm in the middle as a futurist, because I believe that a futurist's role is to look at the trends, help people think about the future, but also influence it and make the future. So that's I don't know if that's a long story short or a short story long, but yeah, I've been operating as a futurist for, I don't know, since about 2012.
And which tell us which futurists have had the most influence on you? You know, one thinks of John Nesbitt, of course, with his mega trends, Alvin Toffler. There's the Singularity University. What's his name? Ray Kurzweil.
Ray Kurzweil.
Yeah, that have all engaged in future studies. What's been your orientation when you look at the future? What is your prism? What are your filters? How do you do it?
Yeah, I guess so. I came from the financial sector. I had my own approach, and I think influenced by Zen at the beginning. The Zen approach to things is to sort of try and keep a clear mind. I love the Zen proverb: "Keep your mind as wide as the sky, but use it like the pin of a needle." And I learned a lot from reading these ancient Zen texts, to try and forge my own path. There's a lot of good work on Zen and creativity, for example. So at the beginning, I really tried not to be influenced by other futurists, like forge my own way, forge my own path. But then over time, I began to meet a lot of well-respected futurists, and I I remember reading the Megatrends work early on, and I thought, oh wow, that's what I want to do, because that's the way I think. I think
Mhm.
we've created a society that's just so fragmented in our thinking. Um, we how can you look at financial markets without looking at broader economics? How can you look at it without looking at legislation and then geopolitics and the ecology and all these other things? And I found within financial markets, people would quite frequently get blindsided because they were so myopic. They'd have their Excel spreadsheets and they would drill into so much minutia, and then they'd just be utterly blindsided by some so-called exogenous factor that wasn't in their Excel spreadsheets. I love that phrase. It's often used to criticize the way universities operate, but I think it's the same for all of our society. But it's we know more and more about less and less, and I think that's begun to change. People are now becoming more holistic, multidisciplinary in their way of thinking. So, yeah, I'd love the way John Nesbitt wrote books. Alvin Toffler. I was just on the phone with Maria, who's the current CEO of Toffler Associates. They put out a book called Aftershock a couple of years ago. They had like 50 futurists write essays. That's an interesting book. One futurist, oh, and of course, I mean, Ray Kurzweil. I mean, I might not agree with him on lots of things. He's more of an engineer than I am, but I think he's been definitely right on aspects of the singularity, which we could talk about. I think we're actually in the singularity now, in some ways. But I really appreciated Barbara Marx Hubbard, actually,
Mm.
uh, because I felt that she really brought that. She seemed to. I never got to meet her. It was a shame. We had mutual friends, and then she passed away before I had an opportunity to ask for an introduction. But she, yeah, she was courageous to talk about spiritual matters as well. And I just don't think that you can talk about the future without talking. You have to be broader and broader in your thinking, and ultimately you have to include philosophy, worldviews, consciousness. And I think Barbara was doing that.
Yeah, well, returning to Nesbitt for a moment, uh, I had the privilege of knowing him for many years and traveling and being with him, and the source of his work, which he did very, very well, was what he called content analysis. And he drew that from the experience actually during the Second World War, that they found that the most accurate way of figuring out what the Germans were doing was not to have the woman sleep with the general and engage in all kinds of intrigue to get him to say things to her, and with pillow talk and so forth and so on, or spies kind of skulking around, but by simply reading the local papers. And the local paper would say that the train is out between such and such a place, or it would report just very local, seemingly uninteresting, uneventful information. And they realized that by gleaning the local papers for the content, they had better access into what was really going on than all the spies that they
Yeah.
were deploying. And John used that, and that's how he started to build up this notion of megatrends, which of course was his major book. I think it was published in 1985. And he went on from there to international fame and much fortune because of that extraordinarily powerful work. And of course, Barbara Marx Hubbard was at the other end of the spectrum. She was also someone I was very privileged to know over many years and interacted with. And for her, the future was an intuitive exercise. It was an intuitive descriptive of human possibility and the evolutionary moment in which we find ourselves, somehow orienting humanity to move from Homo sapiens to what she called Homo noeticus. And so it's interesting to me that you drew from John Nesbitt, but also for someone like Barbara Marx Hubbard. And so your future discernment, I would say, is rather eclectic.
Well, I think a good futurist should be eclectic. I remember when I was in Korea and I met some senior Korean politician, and he said, "Oh yes, the number two at our most prestigious university, KAIST. It's like the MIT of Korea. He's a futurist, and we think he spends 3 hours a day meditating on his head." And I think, well, I think we should all be doing that now. I think we've been stuck in our ways for so long. So I do all sorts of strange things. I look at maps upside down for hours on end and try and get new insights from that. But I think what you said about John's interesting, because I intuitively felt when I was working in investment that everyone was talking to the same group of people, and they'd fly around all these different financial centers. And were they really understanding the countries in which they were investing? How much time did they actually go out into the countryside and interact with regular folk? And I remember reading Jim Rogers' books, Investment Biker. He got a Harley and he drove around the world, and on the back of that made some investment decisions and wrote a book about it. And so I always extended my business trips and spent time in different places. And then I took that into my role as a futurist. I took it very seriously, reading local newspapers, engaging with local people, and that was how one could easily foresee a phenomenon such as Brexit in the UK. But the London elites couldn't see it coming. It was how I foresaw the election of Trump, easily 12 months ahead of the election, because I didn't just speak to my friends on the coast. So I was talking to people in the so-called flyover states, as they sometimes say. And I think it's really important.
Let's delve into that just for a moment, and then we can talk about some other aspects. But what were you observing that others were not? For example, around Brexit. So you predicted that the British would vote in favor of Brexit and that it would take place. When did you know it, and how did you know it?
We're going back in history a bit, but you could see statistically the build-up in frustration towards the elites and against institutions, both in the US and the UK, after the GFC. And of course, you had the
What's the GFC?
The great financial crisis of 08, 2008, 2009. And then you had that little mini rebellion against the financial sector, Occupy, which was then, of course, suppressed. And I was looking at trust in institutions in the US and UK, and just saw it was plummeting, from media to Congress, Parliament. The only institution, the central bank, the only institution that held up. I think the judiciary was for a while. I don't know how that is now when you have events like Julian Assange in the UK, being one of the few journalists on the planet being held illegally, unconstitutionally, I think. And in
Absolutely.
the US, you've had all sorts of shenanigans. But the only institution that held up was the military, which I thought was a very bad sign. And yeah, so I was looking at data like that. I was looking at, anecdotally, I was just talking to people outside London. And it's the same with the election of Donald Trump. And I didn't trust the polls that were coming in. I just felt they might not be completely objective. So I would try and find other statistics. So I would see the engagement levels on YouTube of when a pro-Brexit person was speaking. And you would see it very high. Same in the US with Donald Trump. So Hillary Clinton would speak and only a few thousand people would watch. And then Trump would give a rally and it would go on YouTube and you'd see hundreds of thousands of people watching it. And so I was looking at other tricks I learned in the financial sector, just trying to find other data series. But yes, but some of it was intuitive. I mean, Brexit was really I guess the simplest way of describing it was just a middle finger to our elites. And yes, some people thought through it, and some people actually genuinely had a problem with the democratic structure of the European Union and thought it it had problems. The commissioners suggest law, and they're unelected, and then they say rubber stamped by Parliament. So some people had problems with that. I think maybe we could have stayed in and reformed it. There are other people concerned about immigration, of course. There are lots of different reasons cited, but I think the main reason was everyone was just upset with the two-party system, and they had no way to vent their anger. Mm-hmm. And maybe Trump was a bit like that as well, because he sort of came in and he seemed like a third-party candidate that was going to drain the swamp or cause trouble, and in the end he sort of hijacked an existing party. Yeah, I just sensed this anger building up, and of course I don't think we're fully through that process in the Western world, or at least the UK.
By no means. There's more anger and stresses today than around 2016, 2017 with Trump and Brexit.
Yeah.
But what do you think? I mean, given that, what would be do you have a sense about, for example, the upcoming US election? Do you have a sense about what's going on in Europe with Ukraine or with China? I mean, if you had to make some predictive statements around various trends that you see now, what would they be?
Yeah, I mean, I always thought that the 2020s would be, I think I wrote a little blog in 2019 calling them the tumultuous 20s. And this would be the sort of 2015, 2016 was the sort of the beginning of it all. And then the peak unraveling would happen of our old system would happen in the 2020s. And it's fascinating for me that some of the trajectories I was looking at coincided with the prophecies of many of these indigenous elders. which was astonishing to me, and not just some of the North American elders or some of the elders in South America, but um, people in Japan and all over the world. It's utterly incredible. Um, and I also sat down once for 3 hours with the Dalai Lama's oracle. He had three oracles to advise him on state decisions. And he was surprisingly conversant on financial matters as well as the state of the world. But I I think where we are now is the old system is is in the midst of unraveling. Um, I guess predictions. Maybe we need to take different areas, but I think I think the cycle of war and peace gets worse before it gets better. Um, um, I share your concern over what's happening in Gaza, the proxy war in Ukraine. Um, in some ways, it feels like things are getting worse, ready to like a slingshot to go back in the right direction. So in a way, um, the situation in Gaza is quite symbolic because many of us around the world, our hearts are bleeding watching this unfold. And as you say, it's activating lots of people around the world into a nascent peace movement. And I think a beautiful outcome for the world could be that a statesman emerges in the 2024 US election. I personally quite like RFK. I know he gets a lot of a hard time because he has obviously sued lots of large corporations over the years, cleaned up the Hudson River, taken the environmental mantle, which he won a lot of awards for. But of course, the pharmaceutical industry is one of the richest industries on the planet. And so he gets a hard time for his stance on vaccines, although he does say he's not anti-vaccine per se. He's just pro-vaccine safety. But you know, if you bother to sit down and listen to him on one of these long talk shows for 2 hours and listen to his understanding of the issues and foreign affairs, he puts every other candidate to utter shame. And
Totally.
you know,
Totally.
when I went back and reread some of JF, well, not that I was there when he said them. You might have been Jim, but I a year or so ago I went back and reread some of JFK's talks on foreign policy and the way he was trying to engage. A statesperson like that in the White House, maybe it would be under JFK they called it Camelot. So being a big fan of King Arthur and Merlin and all of that, I'd love it if it was Camelot 2. I could see a situation where suddenly all these so-called enemies, the geopolitical situation in the world could turn around actually remarkably quickly. My fear is it takes another 4 years and a deeper civil war 2.0 in the US as the culture war, comes to a head. But it's entirely possible it happens this time around. But yeah, I mean, happy to talk about. Obviously, I lived in Asia 20 years. I have opinions on all the countries in Asia, which I'm still surprised how many of my friends in Europe and US aren't following what's going on in Asia so much. Given how many 5 billion people live there, and China's now the largest economy in the world by 20% on a PPP basis. It's an important region to
Totally. Well, let's turn to the Asia for in a minute, but before we leave the West, would love to have you comment on the World Economic Forum and the future that the global elites through Davos are uh, articulating around transhumanism and the reduction of population, cashless society, basically a high-tech nirvana if we would all just behave ourselves. Uh, how do you come out on the World Economic Forum?
Well, for full disclosure, I've been on a Global Future Council at World Economic Forum for 3 years, up until a couple of years ago. And that was a group looking at the future of quantum computing. And my so I'll talk about my experience, then maybe talk about the meta stuff. I found that on these global future councils, there were a lot of folk, honest folk, that were very serious about tackling the big issues out there. And I treated, and I still do treat places like Davos just like I might treat the United Nations. There are going to be bad actors or selfish actors in these arenas, but I think you can go into them and you can influence people. And Yeah, I mean, of course, there was a lot of Chatham House rules on some of these conversations, but I remember going to Dubai once, where there was a whole group of these global future councils that would meet on all the different topics, AI, everything from AI to the future of the economy to whatever. And in one of the evenings, um, our group was very actively talking about philosophy and consciousness, as well as and spirituality, as well as quantum computing and the technologies. And everyone wanted to talk to us. People are running over to join our group. Davos is also an interesting place because there's a couple of hundred people in the middle that have enormous power, heads of state and CEOs of large corporations. And then there's a whole bunch of other people. There's a whole bunch of people that aren't invited to it, that just basically gate crash every year and stay in the city around it. And they are, many of them would be very much on your wavelength, Jim. I mean, we've had shaman being brought out there to try and influence delegates. So there's that happening in the background, and in a way, the worse our global situation got, and perhaps the worse our global leadership got, the kind of carnival around Davos and the people. I try not to divide the world into good and bad. My Zen training really goes against that, and I really do believe that most human beings are recoverable. that if you can activate their hearts, that people can change their minds, change their behavior. So when I'm invited into certain forum, I often go in and engage. I guess that's my approach. And I mean, WEF does have, they talk about the agenda, but if you attend any of the events, there's just a lot of open, free conversation. It might be a little bit like a lot of conspiracies out there, that there are genuinely some conspiracies that transpire, but then there's a lot of other things where various actors do not need to even talk in smoke-filled rooms because they're naturally incentivized, motivated to do a certain thing. Many billionaires um, start philanthropic organizations for tax reasons. There's a whole host of things. So I don't, I don't, I'm highly skeptical of governments, especially the corporate lobbying and government nexus. But I don't think some of the conspiracy theories today are getting a little bit extreme. That's all I would say.
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting because Davos is easily the densest concentration of wealth, power, and influence in the world, and the ongoing process at Davos, I think, is alienating more and more people around the world as the global situation continues to deteriorate in the face of the elites, gathering in a ski resort to largely self-congratulate themselves on a job well done in the face of an extraordinarily contradictory reality. So I think, in addition to the notion of whether there's a conspiracy, I think that symbolically, Davos represents an antithesis to the kind of human well-being that most people would like to see. And I think that's part of the ongoing disintegration of trust in our institutions. And I know this is really a global phenomenon as people despair at the capacity of any institution to make the kind of changes that are required, even, for example, in climate change. There's not a single government in the world, not a single institution of note that is doing anything really to ameliorate climate change, other than platitudes. And so what's an ordinary person to do to influence their future when there's so much dysfunction and negative orientation among those institutions governing us, that there's nowhere else to turn. Mm-hmm. So within that context, it's predictable that Brexit would happen, that Trump would happen, because there's no other place to go other than to vent your rage at what's happening, even if in venting your rage, you do something that undermines your own future security, as we're seeing obviously taking place in the UK. Brexit has been catastrophic in by almost every account. Britain is poorer now after Brexit than they were before, more cut off, more disabled, with a conservative government that seems powerless to actually regain an initiative that is already undermined by the very choices it made to support Brexit in the first place. So how do you grapple with that institutional dysfunction in the face of human need?
Yeah, I mean, I've as I've looked at these trends and patterns as my day job, I've certainly gone through phases of feeling utterly overwhelmed and depressed by it. Even having had the foresight that this would all this would all happen. And having attended a couple of the COP events, I took the train up to Glasgow. It cost me 4 times the amount that it would to have just flown up from the south of England. That alone was frustrating. And then only to find that our prime minister was up there, and he took a helicopter back to London for a dinner. And then I spoke to a filmmaker who said the British government was doing arms deals on the side during the COP event when they should have been focused on climate. I was encouraged actually at Glasgow COP by hanging out with the good folk of Scotland, Glasgow, and thousands of people, Indigenous elders who came en masse to lobby the world. And I spent most of my time with them outside the blue zone. And what I realized was that there is a huge nascent movement happening. And whenever I focus on the new story or building the new, I can take positive action. We don't have any statesmen or stateswomen in our, in the G20 at the moment. That is depressing. I suspect Davos won't last 10 years in its current form. So I do agree with you there. Someone on the chat, I think, said I was being a bit protective. I guess I wanted to make the point that you go into these places and you can try and shake them up. But I think we do need a new form. I would embrace new forms of governance. Well, we need a democracy 3.0, basically. I don't think we can solve any of this without solving democracy, which is why third parties will emerge in the Western world, or revolutions. That wouldn't surprise me to see a much meaner version of Extinction Rebellion happening across the Western world. I mean, I think Kim Stanley Robinson, who wrote that book, The Ministry of the Future, talks about environmental terrorism likely to happen in the future. But I think when we look at democracy, it's no longer good enough to just vote and think that you can just vote every 4 years, and that makes a difference. That's why I was so frustrated when Trump was being elected, and all my friends saying, well, just vote for Clinton, that's all you have to do. And it's like, well, no, that's not going to help, and it won't help this time around, and it's not going to help in the UK. So yeah, I think we are seeing the end of this form of democracy. Hopefully it won't be the end of democracy, but
Good. Well, thank you. Let's turn to Asia, where you've spent so many years, and talk to us about your sense of Asia in the following way. It's clear that Russia, China, India, South Africa, Brazil, the BRICS countries, now with Iran and Saudi Arabia and Egypt and other countries joining, another 30 to 40 wanting to join, that Asia is on the rise. And China is articulating a global vision, virtually polar opposites from what the United States has been articulating. And it feels to me that if there's a megatrend, that the largest geostrategic megatrend that I can think of is the decline of the West and the fall of the American empire, with Ukraine being the death knell. and Gaza. The world, I think, is moving now away consciously from US primacy and embracing the rust and belt philosophy of China, and is really coming together to undermine and move beyond the US dollar, which is going to have catastrophic effects on the American political economy. So I would say that the mandate of heaven, to use a Chinese phrase, is moving from the United States to China and the BRICS. So what would be your comment as a futurist on that?
Asia's not one place. Japan, my friends in Japan for years and years were warning me, do not trust the Chinese or the Chinese government. The Koreans were telling me the same thing. And I would see, it was funny, I had front row seats. I had front row seats watching China join the WTO back in 2002. It was actually at Morgan Stanley, where Stephen Roach was the I guess the Western economist that was probably closest to the president of China at the time, and he'd write all these glorious reports about the emergence of China. And for the record, I'm not anti-China. I'm not pro-China. I'm a global citizen. I'm pro-global peace. I think we've gone from, I thought it was madness watching what happened after the accession to the WTO, where Western corporations just flooded out to China and shifted our manufacturing base there. And it became the factory of the world, utterly unprecedented at that level. And some of this was greed, to minimize costs and pay sweat labor. Of course, China did some smart things as well. And then fast forward all these years, and from about 2014, 2015, I'm reading congressional reports out the States talking about the national security risks because China's just overtaken us in quantum communications. And maybe they'll do the same in AI, and now arguably they're challenging the US and Europe on many key technologies, including nuclear fusion. I'm told they're ahead of us. I don't know. It's rather opaque. So I think the West went a little bit too far in transferring all their factories to China. Where do I? So now I think we've probably gone too far anti-China. I was a little bit more hesitant back in the earlier days. What happens next? China's, well, like I said at the beginning, Asia's not one place. There are many actors in Asia, and many of them are strong, still strong allies of the States, like Japan. From a national security perspective, that's why you're seeing a renaissance now in the Japanese chip industry after years and years of losing out to the Koreans, the Taiwanese, and then the Chinese. I think there's a lot of support for this renaissance in the Japanese semiconductor and chip technology industry. I think the latest Sony, God, what do you call them? Those glasses, they've got their 40% components are Japanese compared to only 10% in the iPhone. So that's switching. But going forwards, I don't think it's as binary as the One Belt Road versus America's vision for the future. I do think that we are witnessing the end of the American empire. That might have one day, the milestone might be when the troops were withdrawn rather embarrassingly from Afghanistan, or it might be when we took the action against Russia over Ukraine and it's backfired, and the Russian currency ended up going up. And as you point out, many nations have started to try and build alternative architecture to the the London, New York dominated financial system. But I think there's also just a big non-alignment movement that's happening in India. Is a prime example of that. They don't necessarily want to commit one way or the other. And I know a lot of my friends wouldn't agree with me, but I think a multipolar world is something that, once we've gone through the disarray of the next few years, I think we could come back into quite a nice balance, and a multipolar world could be something that's to embrace. But regardless of China's vision of one belt, one road, I think Eurasia is opening up, and trade across the continent will continue. So I think that's a mega trend that's going to happen regardless of whether China is going to fund infrastructure projects in Kazakhstan.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The evolution toward a multipolar world after the unipolar phase of the last 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union, I think that's over. And multipolarity is now the name of the game. And within that context, the world will be a much more egalitarian place in a certain way, as the U.S. imperium comes to a close. Not that it will go away, but I think the demise of the U.S. dollar as the global currency will have a very deleterious effect on the American government's capacity to maintain 800 bases in 120 countries around the world, because that's a very expensive proposition.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I mean, one of my scenarios is 2035, the US president comes out and decides to shut X hundred of them, or maybe all of them, and goes back to the original constitution of the states.
Yeah, that would be very interesting.
I think could be hugely positive. The end of the American empire could be one of the greatest things that happens to the US. But I also think the other important thing to note, we're still talking about the nation state, but by the mid 2030s, I think it's going to be clearer we've moved away from the nation state. It'll be a messy era, but even after Trump came in, you saw, and well, you're seeing it today with Florida and fighting DC over certain issues. You're seeing states push back against central government. You're obviously seeing fragmentation happening in the UK. I expect Scotland to try and go independent. Again, Wales might go independent. Cornwall might go independent. I see this sort of fragmentation happening all around the world, and that there'll be organizations that are trying to help coordinate, like the United Nations, or a new version of the United Nations, and then there'd be like effectively city states operating and collaborating with each other around the world. So I think that's also, and China, senior Asian diplomats, like formerly retired ambassadors from Korea and Japan to various countries, would always tell me that one of their risk scenarios was fragmentation of China, that the central government wouldn't be able to hold on for another couple of decades. So,
and of course, there's the demographic collapse. I was reading about Korea, not only China, but also Korea, Japan. That's an aspect in even the aging populations of the U.S. and North America and Europe, and the declining birth rates in other countries around the world. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, the demographic collapse. Well, that brings me back to, so it's a global issue. It's interesting that when Jack Ma and Elon Musk, in 2019, had a debate, Jack Ma was incredibly eloquent, and they disagreed on a lot. Funnily enough, Jack Ma was actually really speaking from the heart on quite a few issues. It was interesting. Elon Musk seemed very much more the engineer talking from the cerebral mind. But the one issue they agreed on was the demographic time bomb, that population will be facing population collapse globally. And we probably never get to 10 billion. And China, obviously, China is being affected by that. Japan has for a number of years, in South Korea. One of the issues, before I talk more about demographics, don't forget with China, they're going through a big financial economic crisis at the moment, and they are going to be already, they're exporting deflation. They've got massive excess capacity. So, look at sectors like cars. They've become the largest auto exporter in the world, because the domestic market can't soak it up, and so they're trying to flog their cars and EVs all around the world at discounted prices. So China's not what it was, I guess, when Trump got elected into office. It's going through its own pathway.
Yeah.
In
No
some
one
ways,
is being spared.
no, and in some ways, it's similar to what happened with Japan, when the bubble collapsed in 1989. It took Japan decades to get through its excess capacity and deal with deflation, and China's just at the beginning of that process. But on global demographics, I think it's going to be interesting that there's a view out there, that a lot of, we're all worried. Well, we aren't, but many people in Western countries are worried about immigration and the refugee crisis. That's only going to get worse with climate change, and the
Totally.
I don't use the word climate change normally. I call it an ecological crisis. Climate is just one part of
Aspect. Yeah.
aspect of it. And I think this is where the Republicans in the US can go out and say it doesn't exist, because everyone's too focused on one narrow aspect. Climate is volatile. What is much more provable is the collapse of the biosphere, whether it's plastic in the oceans, dying of the fish, poisoning of X, Y, and Z, and biodiversity collapse. But with the ecological crisis happening, economic instability, I think you're going to see a pickup in forced migrations, even from these elevated levels. But with the demographic time bomb happening, I think that it's not going to be long before advanced nations, will be competing for immigrants, the complete opposite of the current discussions. We'll need more workers. And there's quite a good book by Parag Khanna, who I had conversations with a number of times in the past. He wrote a good book called The Future is Asian, and his latest book is called Move, I think. And it's all about how X billion people might end up on the move in the next phase of human history.
Yeah. Well, listen, let me ask you one last big question. This is a very big one, to get your comment. We're clearly now in the grip of a revolutionary impact due to artificial intelligence. And we're also coming into a realization, even more fundamentally, that we are not alone, that extraterrestrial entities exist. They've been on planet Earth for some time, and they have been exerting influence on human history and attitudes. So as a futurist, how do you see artificial intelligence and the impact that that's going to have on human affairs? And what's your appreciation at this moment as humanity begins its ET moment in coming to terms with cosmic entities that are present on our planet?
So you saved the small questions for last, did you, Jim? I mean, my stance on, I mean, AI, I signed that letter with Elon Musk and a bunch of other AI researchers saying we need to slow this down. I do see that AI has huge potential positives, which we're seeing, some of which we're seeing already, but the risks are also immense in terms of like deep fakes and potential for the creation of much worse versions of COVID, let's say. I think that AI doesn't have to be sentient to kill us. So I'm quite concerned. In fact, I mean the two bigger risks than AI sentience, which I don't think really happens, but that's sort of a deeper philosophical or even spiritual issue. And I don't think it becomes sentient. But one, the risks are AI makes mistakes, and that can be quite horrifying. You know, we saw that with certain Boeing aircraft, for example. Secondly, it succeeds. So a human gives it instructions and it succeeds in those instructions. And they can have terrifying consequences as well. But I'm not so worried about sentience. But I also think, as I'm watching people engage with ChatGPT and these various other AIs that are out there, I see it as possibly as a catalyst to us reevaluating our own intelligence. And I think we've gauged our own intelligence far too narrowly over the years, you know, sort of just the IQ perspective, and that our intelligence is so much vaster. You know, we have spatial intelligence, emotional intelligence, collaborative intelligence, dialogue. You and I were just discussing that before the call, and then maybe intuitive intelligence, which Krishnamurti would have said was the highest form of intelligence. And I think we have these innate, like Rudolf Steiner would say, that we have these slumbering faculties within us that we don't use. Everything from telepathy to all this other good stuff that we know that there's a huge amount of data out there and people doing research on these things, like the School of Noetic Sciences, etc. Yeah, we have these incredible abilities, and I think we've just not been using them. And that AI might be the catalyst, might be the kick up the backside for us to actually go out and harness them. And it's sort of coming at the same time that we're already in a movement a little bit reminiscent of the 60s. We're in this movement of huge interest in the esoteric, in mindfulness, in neuroscience, in Buddhism, in this, that, and the other. And of course, the ET stuff, I don't think people are waking up to it at the moment. I mean, it's like when quantum mechanics came along and upturned, you know, a lot of the theories of physics and engineering. People just kind of carried on and pretended quantum mechanics didn't exist. And despite the Disclosure Act going through last year, and despite all the newspapers talking about this, and I just couldn't believe it when I heard someone in Congress talking about the biological, what's the phrase they're using? Biological
Biologics.
biologics, yeah.
Yeah, those are for the extraterrestrial biological entities.
Yeah,
Biologics, they call them.
yeah. I mean, unbelievable. They're talking about this in Congress
Yeah.
under camera,
That was
and
David Grush.
yeah,
Yeah.
And people just carrying on. I mean, I think, unless someone takes a photo of something and it's put on the front page, it might take a while for people to wake up to the significance of this moment of history. But I mean, this AI, along with what's happening on the ET front, is, I think, the singularity that Ray Kurzweil is kind of spoke about. Of course, he didn't invent the term, but the idea of the singularity was to borrow from physics that there's a point behind which you can barely predict it. It's just it's you're into the black hole, and of course we will endeavor to try and make forecasts and explore what will happen. But I think that it's going to open our minds up to deeper into what is consciousness, and new technologies and new energy. I always thought the energy revolution wasn't going to be more windmills out in the ocean here. I can see a whole bunch here in North Wales, and more solar panels. I always thought that new Tesla-like technologies would be invented. And I think this will be one of the major catalysts.
Mm-hmm. Well, Benjamin, thank you so much. You've been a wealth of wisdom today. I've really learned a lot, and hope that we can have you back down the trail to help us suss out some of the complexities of our radically changing world in every conceivable direction. So thank you. Thank you for all that you offer. Any final word that you would like to leave our group with?
Well, I totally forgot to talk about my approach to futures, the deeper approach, and I can pretty much say it in a sentence or two, and that's when I was an avid skier, people could teach me lots of different techniques of how to ski, but ultimately the core competency was balance. And so when we're looking out to the future, like all your listeners are, or futurists as well, what's the core competency? It's the human mind, and it's our imagination, and I think that's what we really need to focus on now. So spending time on imagining a positive story for the future. Whatever the word, the tagline is, for me, it's a technologically advanced ecological civilization is a word I quite like. David Corton at Club of Rome has been writing about this. Could be a Gaian civilization or a conscious civilization, but I think if we get out of the Hobbesian world of geopolitics and the Hobbesian world of us versus them, and we start thinking like Barbara Marx Hubbard, she had a grander vision of conscious evolution. I think that's what we need to embrace.
Thank you, Benjamin. Technological advance and ecological civilization. That's a beautiful notion. If we could only bring that together, maybe the combination of AI and the ETs will enable us to get exactly to that place. So thank you so much. That'll bring us to a close, everyone, for our Humanity Rising session today. You're all welcome to the after session chat. You'll see the link in the chat box. Benjamin said he'll be able to join for a little bit, so you can expand the conversation with him there, and then we'll see you all again tomorrow. tomorrow for our next session on humanity rising. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Benjamin. Bye for now.